But Luann should know better based on where we are today and based on what her experiences have been, you know, showing up in blackface, these sort of things, to have sensitivities toward a trigger word, which is calling a Black woman angry.
So let's get into Eboni and Luann's big fight this past week about being educated. What did you think about that? I know you kept saying in the moment that no one was listening to each other and it was just kind of chaos. So looking back now, watching it back, what did you think? Were you on someone's side?
Well, I was on Eboni's side. You know, I don't really like to pick sides. I think initially I stand by what I said. Nobody was listening to each other. No one was actually listening to the words that were coming out of their mouth. Immediately we were going toward a trajectory of something negative.
Yeah.
And you know, what Luann was saying was because of Ramona's Catholic upbringing, having to go to Catholic school and things like that, that maybe her style versus someone, you know, born and raised in Queens, or was different. That's what Luann was really trying to say. But Luann should know better based on where we are today and based on what her experiences have been, you know, showing up in blackface, these sort of things, to have sensitivities toward a trigger word, which is calling a Black woman angry. You know, and there's a double standard, which is, it's funny because at the beginning of the season, Eboni and Luann are having a scene together and Luann tells Eboni how eloquent she is. But when I compliment Eboni for really going out there in a very difficult scene, and by the way, I didn't see a camera in the room it doesn't matter when I went to get my handbag, but I was being very honest off camera, like, you did a really good job tonight, girl. Like, that was not easy. And you were really articulate in your communication of very difficult subject matter. But immediately I am accused of microaggressing her, which couldn't be farther from the truth. And she knew I wasn't doing that. But there's a big double standard that I think we have to be careful of. Like, if you're going to own it, then own it, you know, and teach it. So that's what happened in the scene ultimately. And I was very happy with that. I mean, when Luann kicked her out and Eboni left, I mean, it was over. Cameras off, like urgency here. And, you know, so I did my best to explain to both of the women, you know, why this was bigger than us. This is bigger than you. This is bigger than you. This is bigger than us. Like, we have a moment here. And so I implored Luann to take a moment with that, and I implored Eboni to take a moment with that, and then I stepped back. Yeah. And they did the work that you saw.
I'm assuming you saw Leah alluded to the fact that you used the word articulate and that it wasn't the right word, is what she alluded to. What do you think about that? Do you think that word was offensive? Have you spoken to Eboni since?
It is a sensitive word, and I know better. I do know better. But we also have to be not waiting to jump on people for everything. This is everyone's so afraid and in fear of saying or doing the wrong thing. Eboni knew exactly what I meant when I said it to her. I was proud for her. It wasn't an easy moment for her. It's not, you know, a Black person's responsibility to keep explaining, you know, these sensitivities to white folks. I knew, and she knew that. We had a conversation about that. So that is why, you know, Leah felt though she had a receipt to call me a Karen. And I mean, a microaggression, you know, Eboni is saying, like, that's white girl drunk. You know, I mean, there's like double standards. And so I think, like, are you looking to cause a problem? Racism is steeped in intent. What is your intent? And I think if we start to really look at that, you know what I mean? I think that's really what we should be looking at, intent.
You didn't have the warmest welcome back. Were you expecting that? Were you ready for that?
No, I wasn't. I really wasn't. I mean, if they wanted to talk about the podcast, it wasn't like a huge secret, you know what I mean? That I was on the podcast and that I was telling these stories and that it had gotten back to the women. It wasn't a big secret, but so much time had gone by that I definitely didn't expect it to be made this big storyline that it was made. And, you know, I was very surprised about the fourth wall side of things, like reading sensational headlines on the show, which, you know, didn't really have, the headline said one thing, but then when you read the copy, the body of the article, which we all know, it doesn't really totally ever back that sensation with receipts.
Yeah.
So I was surprised about that I had to, and that they kept saying, don't talk about me in the press, don't talk about it. Well, it's not the press, it was my podcast.
Right.
So it's not really about what's on the show, it's about what's left off the show that I found. Some of the conversations that were had around the podcast when I watched the edit aren't in it. Yeah. But it was fine. I felt like I stood my ground on it, and I didn't feel like there was a whole lot of, air in the sails of the argument. Yeah. And I would say all of those things that I said on the podcast, first of all, played out on a reality show 6-7 years ago. There was nothing that was new news. Right. And then we were just recounting it, Carol and I together. Mm-hmm. And it was also a double standard to me because Luann, as we all know, had this very successful cabaret tour that she went on. Mm-hmm. And it was literally written in the script, her docking me and Carol and, saying bad things about us. I mean, it was in the script because it wasn't just one show. It was like 15 shows. Right. It happened. So Luann didn't care about the podcast at all. Yeah. It wasn't Leah's fight, but she made it her fight, and unfortunately, blew it out of proportion.
Right. Did you ever go see the cabaret?
No, I never did. But I got a lot of video clips from it from fans when she was talking shit about Carol and I.
Do you ever regret being uncool?
I was never uncool. I was never uncool. That's another, that's funny too, is that it's the Housewives grinder. So, and I always get caught holding the bag with Luann. I say that all the time. So Ramona and Luann both had strangers at the house for that Turks and Caicos. They had just went out and met them at a club. They didn't even know their names. They brought them back. When Ramona was finished, she said, go, there's a bed, go find yourself a bed, which was irresponsible. And she admitted it to me. Okay. And so I was mad at her because I woke up to a stranger in my room. Okay. Yeah. And Luann had nothing to do with it. I was going into Luann's room for support. Like, Luann, can you believe Ramona did that? And because of her guilt that her guy or whatever had just, escaped out the back door, her guilt is what did that. I'm coming. I wasn't trying to out her for that. And by the way, that it's all Luann. Luann's the one that brings the pirate home. Luann's the one that brings the guy home. And then I get brought into it and I'm left holding her bag. Yeah. So I felt like that could have been an honest conversation on the show, and I would have had that honest conversation.
Did you know in that moment that was going to be such a huge thing this many years later, that everyone knows that as a catchphrase now?
Well, she wrote a song about it. So that's, again, a double standard, right? Luann didn't call, say to me, listen, I'm gonna, and by the way, after the show, because all of that happened and then we weren't really friends, she didn't really return calls, or I'd be out in the Hamptons and we would never get together where I would with, the other women. When that happened, I ran into her at a sushi place in the city. And she was like, I hadn't seen her. And I said to her, we were outside, she was having a cigarette, and I walked out to chat with her. And I said, did you really think that I was trying to out you with some guy? And she goes, of course not. Yeah. So she used the platform on my back. Yep. And by the way, I'm totally fine with it. I never wrote cease and desist over the cabaret, like don't use my name. It's part of the show. I know in my heart what really happened. And so that's all I have to worry about.
The Beverly Hills Housewives, Lisa Rinna didn't want Lisa Vanderpump to use her storyline or anything about her in her new spin-off show, or she should be paid. What do you think about that? Because you guys all have your own businesses now. You have your own podcast, whether it's your cabaret, your podcast. You're going to talk about each other on those things. Like, do you agree with Lisa Rinna? Do you feel like she should be getting some kind of stipend from Lisa Vanderpump?
Well, I'm not totally familiar with the story, but what you're just telling me, I certainly have an opinion. If you're on a reality show on one certain platform with 5 or 6 women, and then they're off doing press and stuff, you're going to get talked about. We're talking about the women right now, right? But if you move to a whole nother show, unless there's a set, like Vanderpump Rules, I remember that show. Like, the other women from the Housewives didn't come onto that show, and they didn't get talked about on that show because it was a separate show. Right. So I would agree with Rinna on this one. If Rinna's going to be brought into that show, she should be paid and contracted.